In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Our first reading today is one of my favorites. Among other things, it brings back memories of a great family trip we had many years ago. I know many years ago because our children were still fairly small at the time. We were in Athens, and on one day we hiked all over Athens. We started out, we hiked across town and we went up about halfway up a mountain that's on the outskirts so you could look down and see the whole city. And then we hiked back into town and we went up to the top of the Acropolis, which is where the Parthenon and all those famous old buildings are from the old days of Athens. And then after we had toured that, we came back, started back down the hill, and we came to the Areopagus, which is the scene of the first reading today. Now, I had read this reading in Acts many times before I went to the Areopagus, and I had always assumed that it was some kind of a open-air market or a square or some kind of a public building, but the Areopagus is in fact an outcropping of rocks that pop up out of this hillside. And it's the one thing I can say without any reservations is exactly the same pretty much today as it was 2,000 years ago when St. Paul was there. Now, what the Areopagus was the first century equivalent of, well, the neighborhood bar, the barbershop, or today, the online chat room or Facebook page. It's where people came together and started talking about things that they were interested in, whether it be sports scores or religion or politics or philosophy. And so on this day, some of the guys who hung out at the Areopagus had heard about Paul in town and what he was saying, and they summoned him to come there and tell us what this is you're talking about. And what we heard in the reading today was the little talk that St. Paul gave to mostly the men hanging out at the Areopagus that day. And he's explaining the gospel as a picture of how to be a Christian evangelist in a pluralistic world where there are many different kinds of people and different kinds of beliefs and different kinds of religions. This is a textbook. This is wonderful. And why it's so important is that's the kind of world we are in today. We don't live in a world anymore where everybody believes the same thing. I heard Peter Berger, one of the great doctors of religion, professors, talking about it. He said they had searched all through Europe, for example, to see if they could find a place where everybody believed the same thing and they were all of the same religion. And they think they had found one village in a kind of isolated canton in Switzerland where that was the case. Everybody was Roman Catholic. But they said that might be the only place left in the world, and probably today it isn't anymore. We live in a pluralistic world. We live in a world where we're constantly coming up against people who have different ideas, different faiths, different ways of seeing the world. And we have a story to tell. We have a gospel to proclaim. So what did Paul do? Well, he didn't stand up and say, "You guys are stupid. You don't know anything. Let me set you straight." He didn't do that at all. What he did do was he started out by being very respectful of them. He says, "I can see that you are a very religious place. I've been walking around your city and I see all of these religious monuments and temples and places. You guys really are serious about your religion." And then he goes on, "And I found this one altar in one place that says, 'To an unknown God.' Well, let me tell you, I know who this unknown God is." Now, what he's done is he's made connections to their life, their experience, and now he's bringing in the gospel. he never comes to the point, now he doesn't apologize for the gospel. He never comes out and says, well, it doesn't matter. What he does say is, I want to tell you that there is one God who created heaven and earth, and although you may not know him, he's been around all the time. And Paul even goes to the point of quoting some Greek philosophers and saying, yes, he's always nearby, he's created the world, you felt him, but now I'm going to tell you, you can know him in a completely different way through his Son, who was a living, breathing human being. So that's kind of in essence what he was doing. Now, I would love to say, and I'm sure St. Luke would love to say, that as a result of that astounding speech, that they all converted. They didn't. As a matter of fact, there was a number of people whose reaction was kind of hogwash. St. Luke reports in Acts that some people replied to him, well, this is interesting, we'd like to hear from you again. But there was no great aha moment. We're told that 2 people that day later became disciples. A man by the name of Dionysius the Areopagite, which means Dionysus from the Areopagus, so he must have been there, and a woman named Damaris. And that was it. Now, I can tell you, if you go back to Athens today, you'll find churches everywhere. You will find the faith has spread all over the town. And it started with St. Paul, some disciples, and a very respectful talk at the Areopagus. When you go to the Areopagus today, if you have a chance, you'll find a plaque on the wall. And it's a metal, it's right on the rock. My Greek is not perfect, but it basically says right here on this spot, St. Paul first brought the gospel to Athens. Pretty impressive. To me it was, to think that right there, and we're making that connection. But it also impressed me as I thought about it, and I still think about it, how much our world is like his world then than it has been in between. We live in this world of great pluralism and difference. Now, there's tended to be 2 different reactions. Well, there's lots of reactions, but there's 2 that I want to talk about are not good reactions to pluralism. One reaction is to try to force everything back in the box, to push us all back to the time where we all believe the same thing and we all behave the same way. Now, first of all, that time has never existed, but we like to think it has. Some people do. And we want to then impose a rigid version of what we think was the ideal of faith. And everybody's going to do it, and that way we're going to get rid of all this dissonance that comes from having a lot of people who believe different things. And we see this in all faiths all over the world. The Islamists who kidnapped the 270 girls in Nigeria were acting on this. We're going to force everybody to live according to Islamic Sharia law. We're going to force them to. Or, Christian fundamentalists who are going to force us, some say, that we're all going to do things exactly the way we thought they were done right in the 1950s. Really can't do that. Although it's a temptation. It's an easy way out to say we're just going to deal with it by forcing everybody to do it the same way. Well, there's several problems with that. One is, of course, Christians should never force people to do anything. That's not in keeping with the example of Christ. It's not humble. It's not kind. It's not loving. I'll give you a couple examples, just recent examples of things that have upset me. One very recent has to do with something very nearby. A football player at the University of Missouri, a guy named Michael Sam, who was recently drafted by the St. Louis Rams. And you've probably all heard the news, he's gay. So I read a big thing in the paper after he's been drafted that a bunch of Christians are going to boycott the St. Louis Rams and any company that endorses Michael Sam for, quote, trampling on our Christian values. Where were their values trampled on? I mean, they may not agree with his lifestyle, but the St. Louis Rams were not forcing them to do anything they don't want to do. They weren't being trampled on. This is an example of something that in family systems theory, Rabbi Ed Friedman used to refer to as counter-evolutionary. Now, I know these people probably wouldn't believe in evolution anyway, but you know, evolution, one of the basic concepts of evolution is that organisms adapt to strength. In other words, the stronger organism is the one that will do better in the world, be stronger, survive, or at least thrive more. But this is counter-evolutionary because it asks people to adapt to weakness. In other words, the basic message is, this hurts my feelings that you're doing something that I don't like, and so you have to stop and do what I want you to do so my feelings will not be hurt. Counter-evolutionary, adapt to weakness. Another example that really has ticked me off is it's in a lawsuit before the Supreme Court, which is, can a corporation, as in Hobby Lobby, dictate to its employees what kind of health insurance and health coverage they can have or not? Because their argument is, it's our money, we can do what we want with it, they have to do what we believe in. That really irritates me more than anything because it's not their money. For one thing, I mean, it's highly top-down and coercive, but it's also, when an employee is working for someone, they earn their health insurance. It's part of their compensation. So once they've earned it, it's not the employer's money anymore, it's theirs. And it's their choice to decide. Now, we can disagree all we want, and I can even have problems with some of the methods of birth control that are legal. But it's not my place to go dictate to someone else how they're going to do their health. And as a Christian, if I claim because of my faith I have a right to force people to do what I don't think they ought to do, I've completely missed the point of the gospel. The gospel is always an invitation, as Paul did, an invitation to invite people into a new, deeper, richer relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Never coercive. Now, I've said that's one reaction to pluralism that isn't good. And the other one, the flip side, is equally bad. And that's the reaction to say, oh, it doesn't matter. As in, all religions are the same. It doesn't matter. You know, you believe what you want to believe. I'll believe what I want to believe. It doesn't matter. Now, part of that, I think we have to do. We have to be able to say, you are free to believe what you want to believe, and I will not force you to change. I think that's right. But evangelism is, again, an invitation. And if we're going to be serious about our faith, we can't say it doesn't matter, because it does matter. God matters. Jesus matters. And if we really believe that, as we heard in the gospel last week, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, we can't simply put up our hands and say, but it doesn't matter. You wonder why so many people, especially, do not go to church now, and particularly mainline churches like ours, is that's the message they've been hearing from us. Oh, it doesn't matter. Yeah, if you want to come, come. If you don't want to come, don't come. It doesn't matter. That's not our message. Our message is we have been redeemed, sanctified, and reborn through our baptism into the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it has fundamentally changed our lives, and it is what makes our lives richer and better and more worthwhile. That's a very different message. To put it in the words of Peter, who really put the two things together so well in our second reading, he says, always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for the hope that is in you. Always be ready to make that defense. Now, he's talking in in the context of expected persecution of Christians. But I think it's wider than that. Not just when we're on the spot, but always be ready to make the defense of the hope that is in you. Always be ready to stand up and say, or act, I think more often act than to say, act in accordance with what Christ has done for us. But he adds to this then, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. It puts the two sides together. We're to be gentle and reverent, and at the same time always ready to proclaim the hope that is in us. That is the way I believe that Jesus has called for us to live in this day and this time. And despite all the differences in the world, if we can respect other people and yet at the same time be able to offer to them the hope that we have through our faith, through our relationship in Jesus Christ, that's how we can change the world. Now, I'm not standing here to say that I am perfect, because you can hear from, there are people that I would much rather be able to simply tell them they're wrong and disrespect, particularly fundamentalists. I know that's a challenge for me. And yet, I also know God is calling me to respect them, to love them, and invite them into that deeper relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Amen.